Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of vignette number 4, titled Ancient Slavery. At the close of part 1 of this vignette, you were shown the means by which slavery gained access into a culture, the moral decaying effect sustaining slavery had upon a people's ability to adhere under the dictates of their conscience. You are also shown the 5 laws of slavery via which slave owners were able to garner great wealth, how they are a corrupted form of the laws of the calling. I will commence part 2 of this vignette by unfolding the unanticipated consequence implementing said laws had upon a people. For once slavery was functioning within a culture, slave owners soon realized the wealth they are obtaining does not come merely by the sweat of those they have enslaved, that rather it comes by the sweat and blood of those they are abusing. For by what their eyes see and ears hear, that harsh truth is rendered undeniable. As it was so rendered, the pangs of a guilty conscience re-awoke within them, that they may sustain the lie that their cultural superiority endows them with the right to rule over those they deem as lesser peoples, and thereby continue to garner great wealth, to do so while being able to escape the reawoken and heightened pangs of a guilty conscience, it is requisite they harden their hearts to an even greater depth, so that once again they might take on the guise of being at peace with their conscience. Yet when they do so, now that it has been rendered undeniable to them how brutal their slaves' lives are, they take this as a warning, that when men's rights are suppressed by their being held to such harsh labors, in due time this will instill an attitude prone to rebellion. But now that they have hardened their heart to an even greater degree, as slave owners they are not merely capable of suppressing the inalienable rights of others, they are now prepared to forestall any rebellion that might arise amongst their slaves by whatsoever tyrannical means they deem necessary. Do so by enacting these 5 additional and far more corrupt laws of slavery. A slave shall not listen to whosoever they like, or believe whatsoever they like, shall not go where they like, nor work against their master by whatsoever means they like, shall not hold an attitude towards their master in whatsoever manner they like. For where the first 5 corrupt laws control slaves when they are at work, these control them when they are at rest. Thus, where the first 5 suppressed the inalienable rights of the enslaved by physically abusing those that did not work hard enough, thereby stimulating them to work harder, the purpose of these latter 5 corrupt laws is, by means of a tyrannical hand, to instill terror within the hearts of slaves. Do so by administering a lingering, pain-filled death on any slave caught breaking one of these laws, as by this means all slaves learn the truly horrific punishment that awaits them if they are ever discovered to be conspiring in any way against their master. How then are open marriages the living embodiment of this viciously corrupt doctrine? It is to be realized that as members within a culture looked to establish slavery, they would face strong political opposition. The means by which they dealt with this opposition was by making the words of those who opposed them seem devoid of merit, did so by stating their political opponents by refusing to sanction slavery or claiming their cultural superiority endowed them with no more rights than those held by their less civilized neighbors, allowing them to connect the truth of their cultural superiority to the lie. They have the right to rule over their culturally inferior neighbors, to thereby have the harsh labors of the day carried out by lesser people, rather than subject the poor but culturally superior people within their own society to said labors. Via said means, they strove to have all who oppose them appear as fools before the general populace, to thereby humiliate their political opponents by having the general populace reject all they have to say. Once these slave owners were established, their next goal was to degrade all who continue to speak out against slavery, those that strive to awaken the general populace to the evils associated with slavery due to the abuses being inflicted upon the newly established slaves within their culture. Slave owners start by making light of their argument by showing how their culture is flourishing due to their owning slaves, that they also take due care of these culturally inferior people in like manner as the rest of their property. But the words of these slave owners take on a far more serious tone when they state, those that continue to oppose the lawful right they have to own slaves can no longer be seen as mere fools to be ignored. For now they look to degrade them by stating they are to be viewed as a small but dangerous group of extremists, as they seek to stir up people's feelings, so thereby they might acquire enough support to instigate a rebellion, designating that for the overall security of their culture, it is needful these extremists are banished, imprisoned, or simply put to death. Thus, to achieve and maintain their rule, those who sustained slavery always needed a strong core of like-minded people, those who, in order to obtain and maintain their corrupt goals, had few, if any, qualms over humiliating and degrading others. So when a couple of proper social status showed, in order to gain what they wanted, they held few such qualms, said couple would be solicited by a couple that represents those who desire to advance their political support in being able to own slaves. The couple that approached them looked to discover if they actually held the capacity to be part of the slave-owning class, to do so by fulfilling the requisite social mores associated with the wealth and status thereof, by strictly adhering unto their corrupt rules. The couple that was being solicited affirmed they held the capacity to adhere unto their corrupt rules, their doing so by proving the dictates of their conscience, being the light of Christ, does not inhibit them from fulfilling the oath of fidelity they must uphold as a new member of said group. How did they prove they were not inhibited by the dictates of their conscience? They did so by wife swapping, as by this means, as a couple, they proved they held the capacity to exchange their oath of fidelity towards one another for an oath of fidelity to the group and its corrupt rulers. By this means, the couple that solicited them functioned as their guarantors to their fellow group members, allowing this new couple to thereby gain access to the wealth and power that comes by being part of the ruling elite. It is to be recognized ancient slavery functioned by means of two corrupted forms of mercy and two corrupted forms of justice. Thus, the living embodiment of these two corrupted forms of manhood and two corrupted forms of womanhood transpired by the corruption of the marriage covenant via wife swapping. It is via said means that slave owners looked to acquire the positions of authority within their culture, as thereby they can have the state function solely via laws of oppression and tyranny. For as they gain positions of political authority, they would install their cohorts into sustaining positions of authority. Yet these acts of blatant nepotism and the purposes behind them could not be openly displayed. To do so meant running the very real risk of generating strong ill will towards them from the general populace. Thus, to obtain the positions of authority they desire, the political group they adhered unto functioned by means of a secret society. As a member of said society, you would be called upon to function before the general populace as the example of being a proper, happily married couple, thereby as the living embodiment of the very best of what your culture stood for, while freely entering into discreet extramarital affairs your spouse approved of and commonly partook in. Of course, in due time, said liaisons lead to the destruction of those tender feelings of mutual regard upon which their marriage had been based. But of course, a divorce could not be sanctioned, for in accordance with her status, and no matter the emotional state of their marriage, the husband had to provide for the financial needs of his wife. The living embodiment of this was slave owners did have one real law of justice they had to fulfill. They had to provide their slaves with clothing, food, and shelter. It may have been of a minimal nature, yet by the need to fulfill this one act, corrupted mercy remained firmly and directly tethered to corrupted justice, in like manner as corrupted manhood remained firmly and directly tethered to corrupted womanhood, so thereby, as a couple, they might maintain the proper appearance before the general populace. But this was not the governing reason a couple would stay together. It has been shown how people were rewarded by the lie, in that, by hardening their hearts, they would escape feeling the pangs of a guilty conscience. However, this was not the only reward one might acquire from the lie. A compelling reason for these hard-hearted couples to remain firmly and discreetly tethered together was they qualified their marriage as being very successful, as by it, as a couple, they advanced within society. For while one spouse developed the skills to clearly see the weaknesses of others, their companion developed those talents required to judiciously exploit said weaknesses, thereby endowing them as a successful couple with the capacity to move upwards within the ranks of the secret society to which they belong, as via them all who partake in their secret society are endowed with the capacity to acquire additional political power and further financial gain. Thus, within this society, a marriage only qualified as being a failure if said couple lacked the social panache to work together in being able to see and find joy in exploiting the weaknesses of others. As for partaking in these sexual liaisons, they transpired with relative ease, as those who sustained slavery had hardened their hearts to that degree by which they could partake in said affairs, void of feeling any guilt of conscience. Indeed, these men and women justified their not feeling said guilt by telling themselves the forms of morality that apply to common people do not apply to them, for via their capacity to see and exploit the weaknesses of others, so thereby they might prosper, they are an elect group. This attitude not only endowed them with the belief that they had the right and responsibility to own slaves, as thereby their society prospered, it caused them to believe they also had the right and responsibility to rule over those they deemed as their far less mature fellow citizens, as they held to the belief, if they allowed themselves to be ruled over by commoners, it would not only lead to their honor being besmirched, in that their opinion could be deemed of less value than a commoner's, causing them to be humiliated. For if this transpired, they feared, by that which they referred to as their immaturity, commoners could end up adhering unto the outdated and foolish dictates of their conscience, thereby end the right of any within their society to own slaves, and thus, as former slave owners, degrading them in their standing before the general populace. Thus slave owners, in their determination to stop this from happening, always sought to present and maintain themselves as the elite members of their culture, by always seeking to function before the general populace by that subtly associated with pomp and ceremony, as by said subtlety they established as virtually unassailable their legal standing as the lawfully authorized guardians of their culture, those who were predestined to affirm what their culture represents, allowing them to establish laws that suppressed the rights of any to disagree with them in regards to how their culture should function, to, if any broke said laws, act with a tyrannical hand in suppressing what they would label as an act of rebellion. But this need to function via pomp and ceremony meant slave owners could not sully their hands by directly ruling over their slaves. Thus it was requisite they hire taskmasters, men that by acts of overt brutality instilled obedience from slaves, while they, as their society's cultural elite, ruled by means of pomp and ceremony, their iron hand sheathed within a silken glove. In closing, I duly recognize that in the highly diverse array of cultures in which for over 30 centuries ancient slavery thrived, it seldom functioned in full accord with the manner laid out within this vignette. The reason for this was due in large part to the social restraints placed upon women. For so long as said restraints were in place, the capacity of the lie to direct married couples in being able to become the complete living embodiment of said doctrine was restricted, which therefore meant the horrors associated with the corrupt doctrine of ancient slavery were never fully instigated, which also means it is time to pull the rabbit out of the hat, as the previous statement alters everything. For today, via means of the equality established between men and women, couples that partake in wife swapping are far more capable of developing the cruel emotional attributes ascribed to said doctrine. Thus, it is needful you recognize this unyielding fact. In the past, it was the licensing of ancient slavery that led to corrupt sexual conduct becoming the norm within a culture. Today, it is the licensing of corrupt sexual conduct that must unavoidably lead to the full and complete restoration of slavery. For it is by means of the reversal of this process that the lie seeks to plunge the world back into darkness, one in which the light of the sun, moon, and also the stars will be extinguished. For this time, slavery will take on a form wholly new to our understandings and far more terrible in its capacity to flourish, being able to come to pass by the beguiling teachings had within the doctrine of total inclusion. For this is the great darkness that awaits us if the course of events is not altered, transpiring via people's corrupted sexual conduct, endowing them with the capacity to be guided by the lie in being able to effectively see and judiciously exploit the weaknesses that reside within their fellow citizens, do so for their financial and political gain and for that of their cohorts. The consequence for any society that sustains these corrupt sexual relationships are, said affairs can only transpire by a hardening of one's heart against adhering under the dictates of your conscience, a hardening of the heart that in due time causes those who partake in said affairs to feel few qualms over exploiting the weaknesses they see in others, do so under the guise of being at peace with their conscience, as by means of said guise they perceive how they and their cohorts can garner financial wealth by humiliating their political opponents, as thereby they can place laws of oppression over others, via said guise sustain themselves and their cohorts in political power by degrading their political opponents, as thereby they can place laws of tyranny over others. In light of said truths, I trust you see why the corrupting nature of wife swapping precludes all who partake therein from acquiring that mindset conducive to sustaining America's Declaration of Independence, why under said declaration wife swapping can never be licensed. In closing, I affirm within the following vignettes, by a truth rendered undeniable, all I have stated shall be properly and fully unfolded to you. Of this and all the forestated, I do most solemnly testify of it being the truth, and do so in the sacred name of Jesus Christ. Amen.